Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens. Now, much of recent debate about geopolitical competition focuses primarily on how issues like the US-China rivalry have played out in Europe, South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and the African continent. But geopolitical developments and global political tensions, of course, have also played out in Latin America. 4 countries in Latin America made a turn to the Pacific in 2011 through the Pacific Alliance, and Latin American countries have recently been drawn into global discussions around technological competition between China and the US and other issues. Actors like China are increasingly diversifying their engagements with the region through development and trade, but also military cooperation, to the chagrin of the US. However, countries in the region aren't passive actors, and in some ways also have the ability to drive global politics. So, how is geopolitics playing out in Latin America, and how are countries in the region shaping developments in global economics, technology, rules, and norms? Joining me today are two of my colleagues from the IISS's London office. Dr. Irene Mia is the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey and Senior Fellow for Latin America and Conflict Security and Development. Amanda Lapo is Research Associate for Defense and Military Analysis. She contributes to the research, collection, and validation of defense and military data for the IISS's flagship publication, The Military Balance, as well as for other IISS publications and databases. Welcome back to the podcast, Amanda and Irene.
Hey, Meia, nice to be back.
Hi, Meia, thank you very much.
So maybe let's start with a really broad question. How has the shifting global geopolitical environment impacted Latin America? Irene.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Meia. As you mentioned in your introduction, I think the main nexus to look at is really US-China, right? Because if you look at the Latin American order is not anymore a unipolar order with the US as the main actor looking after its backyard, but you have seen in past years from mid 2000, you've seen really China making big inroads in the region. So I think in reality, what we are seeing now, it's we're in a bit of a wait and see mode, given that obviously that has been, as I said, provoked on one side by the fact that China has increased its economic statecraft in the world and in the region, but also by a progressive disengagement of the US, which has culminated, I would say, under the Trump years. So as I said, we are all waiting in a way to see what's going to happen with Biden. Obviously, there are big expectations on him re-engaging with the region and therefore actually shifting again the balance towards the US. But so far, I have to say, there are little signs in that respect, but not much has happened. I mean, saying that, of course, we have seen changes in the most notable and most controversial policies that Trump had adopted in terms of migration. The US is actually battling at the moment a major migration crisis. If you look at apprehension at the border in the last 3 months, there have been something like 200,000 apprehension every month from March. And the most dramatic element has been probably the fact that a lot of those people are actually minor, doing the travel and the journey to the US without their parents. So it's quite, from a humanitarian point of view, it's quite dramatic. But I think so. If we look at what Biden has done with respect to the border and to the migration, which I would say will continue to be the main focus, right, because of the domestic implication of migration flows from Central America to the US. He has changed and he has cancelled some of the most controversial Trump policies, including constructing the famous wall between the U.S. and Mexico, and some other policies. He also has given temporary protection to Venezuelan already present in the U.S., something around 300,000 people. He has kept some of the Trump policy, notably on a historical low cap on the number of refugees, and also limit on asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. I think the most important part of his policy towards Central America has been this focus on the root causes of migration, so climate change, corruption, but also creating opportunities notably in the countries of the Northern Triangle in Central America. Also, $4 billion have been earmarked in 4 years to really create those conditions at home in those countries. I think the challenge there is going to be finding an interlocutor in the region, because as we have all sadly witnessed during Trump year, is that there's been also a complete disregard for rule of law, or putting pressure on those countries really to comply with a rule of law standards. So at the moment, the situation in Latin America has deteriorated from a rule of law point of view. I won't name, but obviously El Salvador is a concern, but also Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua. We have election very, very, very soon. I don't know if you have followed, but basically 4 of the candidates have been arrested, of the opposition candidates. So I think the problem for Biden would be implementing his policy, which in any case is going to take a long time, right? Because we won't see changes in terms of condition in Central America in the short term. But it's going to need to be to find a counterpart to do so in the region, because obviously the government are not necessarily the good interlocutor for Biden. The other big, I think, area of geopolitical contention, which is Venezuela, and when I say really, it's really the theater where the great power competition is playing out in Latin America. We have the intervention of China from an economic point of view, but more from a diplomatic and political and military point of view. We have Iran, we have Russia, we have Turkey. Amanda will tell you more about that. But basically, what we have seen with respect to Venezuela is that Biden hasn't done much, in the sense that he hasn't revoked some of the sanctions. He hasn't really taken a lead so far in engaging in a negotiation between the two presidents of Venezuela. I think there, and also with respect to Cuba, which is the other variable in the equation, also with respect to Venezuela, I think we will have to see whether he would think it's worth really going against his domestic constituency in Florida to really take the lead on a negotiation process between Guaido and Maduro, or whether it will let other people actually, or other actors, including the EU, leading the process. The other aspect I would say, you mentioned, Meia, it's really this aspect of the tech war, right? And Latin America, it's really one of the region where this is playing out quite massively, with a lot of infrastructure investment, also in the digital infrastructure by China, the involvement of China corporate, including Huawei in the deployment of the 4G, but also I guess the next area of war is going to be really the 5G. I guess that as well, we'll have to see what's going to be the stance of the US in a way for Latin America. It's very hard now to really cut off China from that, because obviously China has become a very important partner for the region commercially and investment, trade and loans. At the same time, obviously Latin America is going to be increasingly cash strapped after COVID. So obviously China is a easy option there. So I think realistically, it's probably going to be a competition. A competition is going to be also a coexistence between China and the US.
Just to pick up on something that you said, Irene, you talked about the backsliding of democratic norms and governance in certain countries in Central America and perhaps even Latin America. How is Biden's approach to the US's foreign policy based on democratic values going to play out in the region, and how will that be received?
That's precisely, I think, the matter of the question at the moment. I think in a way for Latin America and Central American particularly, the Trump year were kind of easy, because it was very easy in a way to deal with Trump. The only thing he was interested in was migration. He wasn't that interested on how countries were doing, apart from really making sure that the migration was controlled in a way. Now, as you mentioned, Biden is focusing very much on corruption, rule of law. And I think this is going to be an issue. It's going to be an issue with many countries in Central America, as I mentioned. It's going to be an issue even with Mexico, because in a way, we have seen lately in Mexico there's been quite a concern in terms of freedom of the press, some attitude and also attack from the president on journalists and people that disagree with his views. So I think the problem with that is that for Biden, corruption and fighting corruption and rule of law seems to be, and rightly so, seems to be at the center of his way of engaging with Latin America. I think this is going to could have, and it's already having some kind of geopolitical implication, because obviously China is there. So and China is much less worried about those kind of issues, and we have seen it already with El Salvador. El Salvador is actually moving towards China much more. We have seen it in Venezuela, of course. It's interesting, even in terms of vaccine diplomacy. I guess we'll have to discuss about vaccine diplomacy. This is the big topic. But if you see, for instance, how AMLO or López Obrador in Mexico, when it was actually at some point begging Biden to send the vaccine to Mexico, Biden didn't send the vaccine. It just moved to Putin, and Putin was very happy to comply and send vaccine. And so I think it's again, it's interesting to see. And I think, to be honest, this focus on the rule of law is going to play out quite significantly in terms of geopolitical realignment or alignment in the region.
So it would be fair then to say that today, when we look at the region, we see a diversification of the countries who have interests in Latin America. Is this something that's particularly new, or have these actors been present and interested in the region for a number of years now already?
So I think it is. I would reply from 2 points of view. One, it's really, if you look at the actual data, the hard data, the trade and economic data, then you see that obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning, China is really the country which has made inroads in the region. So if you look at the trade data at the moment, China is actually the largest trading partner if you exclude Mexico, because Mexico is still very much tied to the U.S. For the type of the NAFTA and the maquila kind of production pattern. That being said, it is true that there has been a lot of talks, a lot of initiative really to diversify trade partners and commercial and investment partner in the past few years. You mentioned the Pacific Alliance, which is the big star in that respect. So basically, really, if you look at the Pacific Alliance, which was really putting together what I call the Pacific country of Latin America, so Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia. The idea was really the Pacific Alliance really make of the idea of projecting towards Asia and towards the rest of the world as their mantra. So the idea was really, we need to really reach out to the rest of the world. We need to reach out to Asia. India is another country which has shown increasingly interest trade-wise in the region. There has been increase in trade, bilateral trade between the two regions. From a very small number, so obviously it's not a huge number yet. Middle East, there's been quite a lot of interest also from the Middle East in the commodities and food commodities from Latin America. I think, on a side note, it's quite interesting because, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there is I would say, a recreation on the global south scale of this kind of periphery center pattern of trade of Latin America, whereby Latin America, unfortunately, continues to remain the provider of commodities and is not really providing manufacturing or evolving in the supply chain, in the value chain, as we're going back to the 60s and 70s theories of dependency for Latin America. So I would say then there is, as I said, there is quite a lot of interest, lots of initiative. But if you look really at the numbers haven't shifted much. Also, if I can add to that, I think things are changing also in Latin America in the past 2 years. There is probably less appetite to engage with the rest of the world. And this is something that is interesting, because if you look at Latin America in the past 10, 15 years, Latin America in a way was swimming against the uptide, in a way, because upstream, I repeat, Latin America was swimming upstream in a way, because actually it was the only region which was very, very pro-globalization, and you had both on the political discourse, but also if you look at the polls, people are really much for opening up to the rest of the world. I say from 2019, really the discourse has shifted very much. Also, with all the protests we have seen in the region, towards really focusing on the problems of the region, having to do with inequalities, and this kind of shifting away from a consensus around neoliberal values. And what you have seen also with the pandemic is that what people are asking for, and therefore politicians move to, it's really more big role of the state. Let's focus on the issues in domestic issues. And if you look at Mexico or Brazil, again, Brazil has always been very, very inward-looking, but Mexico has always been a champion of free trade and being open. With López Obrador, we are moving back to really focusing internally. And the same you're seeing now in Pacific Alliance, and that's something that I wrote a blog on that 3 months ago. Now I need to change it completely, because in a way, with the election in the region, we are moving even there. I mean, do we still have a Pacific Alliance? Is it still relevant? We have, if you look at what's happening in Peru, where we had election last weekend, Castillo won. This person came out from nowhere, very much, leftist and very much inward-looking. Chile is moving probably in a similar direction we have seen with the election for the Constitutional Assembly. Again, as the majority of candidates are very much new candidates, people that don't have experience in politics. So I think what we are seeing, and probably that would be my forecast if I had to do a forecast, is less appetite from the Latin American side, even less appetite to engage with the rest of the world.
You mentioned China a number of times, Irene, and I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive into the case of China's engagement in the region. Because, of course, while we initially knew that the Belt and Road Initiative didn't extend much further than Europe or the Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, it, of course, increasingly does extend to Latin America. And you've mentioned the increasing trade ties and investments that China has made across the region. But of course, there's another element to that relationship, and that's in terms of military engagement as well. And here I want to bring in Amanda. And I know, Amanda, you've been working quite recently on this in some detail. What does military-to-military engagement look like between the PRC and countries in the region?
So we can definitely say that, as Irene mentioned before, China has been making substantial progress in making an inroads into the region and become, like, what can we say, basically the third largest player after the US and Russia in the region. First, we can say that China's People Liberation Army has been using military diplomacy to strengthen and expand its defense relation in South America, especially in the last decade or so. So to achieve that, it has been fostering a wide range of activities, including bilateral, high-level and low-level military visits, port calls, military training, academic exchanges, and military operations other than war, which usually includes disaster relief operations and humanitarian assistance. Not to mention, of course, military equipment donation, which leads me to the fact that even defense equipment export has been increasing. The Chinese one has been increasing in the region. So we can see that, although it's fair to say that the pace at which these initiatives are progressing, it's very different across the region. We can definitely notice there has been a progress from basically China not being present at all in Latin America to be, for instance, like Venezuela first armed provider right before the crisis that hit the country very badly. So in terms of military diplomacy, what is interesting to note is that basically China's agreements signed with Latin America in terms of defense and security are usually part of like wider framework agreements that encompass economic and technology and environmental agreements and within the countries. And this is actually indicative of the fact that security and defense is just like one of the aspects that China is focusing on in the region. So which is part of like a wider goal and a wider aim in the region. But we've been noticing there is the relationship between, especially in South America, which I've been focusing more on, have become more formal, and that led to the signature of different agreements. For instance, we have Venezuela, Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil, which have established highly structured military diplomatic relationship with China, having signed several memoranda of understanding and even comprehensive strategic partnership agreements, and also having established a joint defense committee with China's military authorities to discuss and implement these agreements, which is something which is very, very highly structured and formal. These agreements are usually been signed in high-level bilateral meetings, which have occurred more and more frequently in the region over the past 5 years or so. Also, China has established some defense fora with the region. For instance, like the PLA's Latin America High-Level Defense Forum, which, as it's now in its 4th iteration, it's a very important hub, especially for military in South America, to discuss the issues, the most pressing issues with China. And this is very interesting because these exchanges have been brought benefits for both parties, and this has enabled China to know better the military institutions and also develop ties in the region to make more inroads, and also to be able to, in a way, foster and advance its own values from a geostrategic perspective, and gain also the trust and of some of the country's militaries, which is very useful, especially for some countries that have very strong military very strong military apparatus, which sometimes it's stronger than the government. So also at a lower level, another very interesting factor is that China has been using port calls to tighten up its relationship with some of the countries, especially in South America, from a commercial perspective, from a military perspective, by doing some military exercises, and also providing humanitarian assistance through its hospital ship, which is called the Peace Ark, which has toured Latin American and Latin American countries, the Caribbean, and some Central American countries, to provide medical support to the population that sometimes has been hit with natural disasters, but also to train its militaries to provide medical assistance to the population, which is something which is very important in Latin America, where the armed forces sometimes have other tasks rather than just the traditional ones. In terms of equipment transfer as well, China has been very generous with some of the Latin American countries. Initially, I would say up to 10, 15 years ago, their main relationship was with socialist-leaning countries, which were more politically affiliated with China. For instance, Bolivia benefited greatly from over $45 million worth of military equipment donated from China, ranging from logistic equipment to medical military equipment, and also proper arms and weapons. As China's relationship with other countries in the region expanded, we could see that donations started to focus also on other countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, which are not traditionally socialist countries, which are usually affiliated to China. And this is also very interesting because military donations can also be considered as the beginning of more traditional defense relations, which also include proper arms exports and sales.
Right. So a very wide-ranging area of engagement then between the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China, and various different traditional but also newer countries in the region that seek to foster greater ties. And I commend your area of research, but also note that fits particularly well into this wider narrative that we've seen under Xi Jinping, of course, whereby defense now plays a key role in its foreign policy and in its policy and its and China's pursuit of its interests abroad. In terms of arms sales and arms transfers, Russia has been a traditional partner in some countries in Latin America as well for this. So do we see a cooperation or a competition in this area between Russia and China in the region?
I would definitely exclude the cooperation bit between the two countries in this particular area. What I have to say is that China has been quite a discreet competitor in a way, in the sense that it started basically creating its own relationship without openly meddling with Russia. But of course, we can say that China, in a way, saw the main client for Russia in the region, which was Venezuela. So, of course, Russia is a traditional arms exporter in the region, as I said, for mainly socialist-leaning countries. But starting from 2005, we could say that Venezuela opened the doors to Chinese military and defense industry in general, and started procuring, for instance, air surveillance radars, light attack trainers, and then a wide variety of infantry fighting vehicles and other sort of logistic equipment that in a way encouraged other countries in the region, starting, as I said, from Bolivia to then Peru, to actually bandwagon on the China side to start procuring military equipment from them as well. So this created some sort of market in the region. Also because, of course, because of China's competitive prices, we're talking about a region where defense budgets are pretty small, especially for some countries. In a way, China started to erode the market for Russia. Although I have to say that besides the Venezuela example, and we all know that after 2014, 2015, Venezuela economy collapsed, and now defense procurement programs are basically non-existent. I can say that China has not managed to fully challenge the strong relationship that some countries have with both the US, Russia, and sometimes even Europe in terms of defense procurement. I have to flag up there have been several issues that Latin American and South American countries more specifically encountered with Chinese defense equipment. In terms of operational capabilities, in terms of contract, in terms of all different procurement issues. that didn't make them basically a super reliable actor in terms of defense exports. So although there is some activity, especially I would say in some countries, China has not fully succeeded in challenging the role of Russia and, of course, the US.
So we've looked at the region very much through the lens of what other countries are interested in and how they're engaging with the region. But I want to broaden out a little bit again to think about what leverage countries in Latin America have to influence geopolitical competition themselves in line with their own interests. Irene, from what you said before, the region is turning inward. So is that even a valid question to ask?
It's a valid question, I think, because you're right. I mean, I think in general, if you look at the recent history of Latin America, it has been punching way below its weight because, obviously, after all, it's a 600 million people area. It's a $5 trillion GDP, so it's not an irrelevant part of the world. In reality, in a way, Latin America has been more of a maker of less of a maker of rules than a taker of rules, of global rules and geopolitical decisions. I think part of it has to do really with the impossibility the region has had in the past to come up with a common position and to really unify in some fashion. And this is something you see. I think the region is probably the best example of countless experiments of regional integration failed, which is quite remarkable. Look at the G20. You have 3 Latin American countries part of the G20. Did you ever hear about a Latin America agenda being pushed at the G20? No. So I think, in a way, there is that. I think now you have this internal additional ardor in that sense. But at the same time, I think it would be a good moment for the region to actually take a place at the global table, because I think its geopolitical importance has risen a little bit. And I think for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm thinking of for instance, the pandemic-induced desirability of developing supply chain for essential goods near to home, and home in this case being the US. The Latin America could actually for once leverage its closeness to the US to really try to insert itself in those supply chain in a more profitable way for the region. That's one. Second geopolitical lever, I think, is the importance of Latin America for global climate security. And this is not just for having, obviously the Amazon there, but also the importance. Latin America is probably one of the most biodiverse region in the world. It has lots of potential for developing renewable energies, wind, sun, and all those things. So I think its importance has increased. Also, I think the importance of Latin America for America's stability and because of the nexus between obviously migration crisis and stability in the US, that's very important as well. And the last thing, and probably the most important, is the fact that it should be able to leverage a more multipolar order in the region, right? And we have seen already a bit of that, but it could be done more, because obviously now it's not just having to deal with the US. If you don't like what the US tells you, there is China, there is Russia, there is a lot of other sympathetic players there. So I do think there are the conditions. The question, as you said, Meia, is whether they would want to do so, because as I said, I do sense a much less appetite for engaging with the rest of the world.
Amanda.
I also want something that I wanted to add on defense industry on a regional perspective is that some countries such as especially Brazil, partially Argentina, have their own defense industry, which although it's not very developed, they still produce enough equipment to partially fulfill their internal procurement needs, on top of course procuring from mainly the US and other European countries, and also a bit Israel. and they also export a little bit within the region. So countries such as, for instance, Brazil, even Chile, and partially Argentina, although they did procure some Chinese equipment, are not very interested in exploring China as a possible, like, a major provider for arms exports.
Fascinating. So limitations to what China can achieve in certain countries. Just in terms of, one thing that you said about countries perhaps leveraging this opportunity to shift their identity or align more closely with within this fragmented geopolitical landscape or multipolar geopolitical landscape. Do you think that the recent decision by countries, for example, Chile's decision to use to sign an agreement with a Japanese company for a Pacific submarine cable instead of, for example, China. Do you think that that was an indication of countries aligning themselves more flexibly within the region?
Yeah, I do see that happening. I think there is an increasing willingness also to be more flexible in that respect, right? So I think, as you mentioned, the Chile case, but also I think it was quite what I mentioned previously about Mexico going to Russia for vaccine is quite interesting because Mexico is really the ally of the U.S. in the region, and it's as I always say, so far away from God and so near to the United States. So in a way, it was an interesting thing. Also, if you look at the vaccine diplomacy we have seen in the region, something which is quite impactful, and I wanted to mention, if you look at the number of doses, I was looking yesterday at the number of doses provided to Latin America. China has provided under 65 million doses. The US at the moment, 2.5 to Mexico, just after much begging. So I think even there, it's interesting to see, similar to what Amanda was saying, the countries which are not normally aligned to China, but that's actually very, very kind of in the center or liberal or right wing, like Brazil and Uruguay, for instance, they're relying very much. Chile, they're relying very much on vaccine coming from Asia, which is something interesting because you wouldn't think that it's in line with the normal geopolitical alignment. At the same time, another thing which is interesting noticing is that you mentioned earlier on the Belt and Road. 19 countries of Latin America are part of the Belt and Road, but you have countries like Brazil or Colombia, which are actually very much integrated with China already. I mean, obviously, all the countries which export commodities in the Southern Cone and in the Andean countries are much more connected to China from a trade point of view. Still, they're not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there it's quite interesting to think that those countries are kind of doing this very delicate balancing act between the US and their identity, which is probably more still towards the US in terms of common values and way in which they look at themselves, but still keeping China on the side. So I think we're going to see a lot of that going forward. This kind of shifting of identities and maybe countries with different identities at the same time, which I think it's an interesting way to proceed. Is very pragmatic, and I think it's probably much more successful than just sticking to one's identity with trade, politics, and other dimensions.
Fascinating. Well, we're running out of time, but before we sign off, I'd like to ask each of you what the one thing is you'll be watching for in the next few months with regards to your respective areas of research. What should we be watching out for? Amanda?
Definitely, I will keep having a look at People Liberation's Army engagement in the region, especially in South America. Of course, now we're cooperating on a paper together, scoping the defense and security implication of their increasing presence in the region. So it's definitely something I will keep an eye on.
Great. And Irene?
Well, we are now working full speed on the armed conflict survey. So what we are actually working on is looking really at this shifting identity of cartels and criminal groups in Latin America towards becoming almost political or quasi-state actors. So I think it's an interesting area of study. The other thing we're looking at, what I mentioned earlier on, is really climate security. So really looking at Latin America role in that more general global issues, in particular with the issue of funding coming from the US to Central America, and now those funding will be used and how to use them in the best way among the current challenges of governability and governance and corruption.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you both for your insightful conversations and insights today on the show. And I hope to see those publications shortly, and also, of course, welcome you on the podcast again soon.
Thanks, Meia.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. And for more in-depth analysis of the key international security and defense issues from around the world, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit the IISS website. Thank you and see you next time.